In the quiet heart of the Altiplano, at over 12,000 feet above the sea, there lies a place where earth and heaven seem to touch. It is not a land of ease or plenty. The air is thin. The sun, though brilliant, gives little warmth. Yet here, near the deep and sacred waters of Lake Titicaca, a people once shaped a world that would long outlast their names. This land, now straddling the modern border of Bolivia and Peru, was the setting for one of the earliest and most mysterious civilizations of the Andes. Long before the rise of the Inca, long before the stones of Cusco or Machu Picchu were laid, there stood Tiwanaku. Not merely a city, but a sacred center, perhaps the very birthplace of the world in the minds of those who came after. According to later tradition, it was from the waters of Lake Titicaca that the great creator god, Viracocha, rose. His name would be whispered across the centuries, from Lake Island to Imperial Court. He brought light where there was darkness. He shaped the sun, the moon, the stars, and gave to humankind the gift of order. It is said he walked across the land, raising the first people from the stones and teaching them to live. When his work was done, he vanished over the sea, promising one day to return. And so, the people who dwelled beside the lake built in his honor, or perhaps under his inspiration. No written record tells us who they were, nor what they called themselves. But the traces they left behind speak with quiet power. Great monoliths, carved with figures whose meanings are half lost. Vast ceremonial platforms aligned with the sky. Stones fitted so precisely they seemed to deny time itself. Tiwanaku was no ordinary settlement. It was a vision etched in stone, grown from the very bones of the land. It would endure for centuries and influence cultures for miles in every direction. And yet, in the beginning, it was only a promise, a seed in the soil of myth and stone, nestled between lake and mountain. From this place, and from this silence, our journey begins. Long before Tiwanaku rose in stone and solemn grandeur, the winds of the Altiplano carried simpler sounds, the rustle of grasses, the breath of herders, the low calls of llamas across the open plain. Here, at over 12,000 feet above the sea, life was not easy. And yet, it was here, on this vast, sunlit plateau, that one of humanity's quiet triumphs began. People had walked these lands for thousands of years. As early as 1500 BCE, long before Tiwanaku took form, communities had begun to settle near the shores of Lake Titicaca. They were not builders of cities, but stewards of earth and sky. They knew the cold nights and the burning sun. They learned how to plant in poor soil, how to herd animals that could bear the thin air, and how to listen to the rhythms of the land. They were farmers and herders, crafting lives with patience. The potato, the quinoa plant, the hardy tubers of the highlands, all were tamed here, where few others could thrive. The people built small canals and terraces. They domesticated the llama, not only as a beast of burden but as a vital link in the chain of survival. And above all, they watched the sky. From generation to generation, knowledge passed not through written word, but through careful hands and silent memory. They understood when the rains would come, how to shape the land to resist frost, and where to plant for the best harvest. Out of this wisdom emerged the first raised fields, sucker collars, the ancestors of a grander agricultural system yet to come. But it was not only food that bound these early people together. Ritual shaped their world. In caves and on rocky slopes, offerings were made, shells, bones, miniature figures, left for the spirits of mountain and lake. There were places marked as sacred, where stone met sky in ways that stirred reverence. Even in these early centuries, the sacred and the practical were never far apart. So it was that a culture grew slowly, rooted in the soil and stars, long before it took the shape of monuments. It was a culture that knew how to endure, how to adapt, and how to wait. In time, that waiting would bear fruit. Communities clustered more closely. Ceremonial centers began to appear. And in the heart of this great plateau, the people would raise their eyes, and their stones, toward the sky. That is where we go next, to the early growth of Tiwanaku, when faith and labor carved the first true outlines of a city. As seasons turned and centuries passed on the high plateau, quiet settlements near Lake Titicaca began to stir with new intention. Small communities, once content with survival, slowly drew together. Trade paths lengthened. Ceremonial gatherings grew in number. And somewhere in the heart of it all, on the southern edge of the lake, a transformation began. Here, where the wind swept over the fields and the waters mirrored the stars, a settlement took root. At first, it was no more than a village of modest dwellings and raised fields. But from the 2nd century of the Common Era, something deeper began to unfold. Families aligned their homes with the sun. Fields grew broader. A new rhythm took hold, not of mere subsistence, but of vision. By the 5th or 6th century, that rhythm had gathered strength. People from neighboring valleys and distant slopes came to this place, drawn by its growing importance. Ceremonies became larger. Spaces more organized. The settlement blossomed into something greater, a ceremonial center, ringed by residences, fields, and sacred spaces. Tiwanaku was becoming a city. But this city did not rise as others had. There were no great conquests, no sudden rise of kings. Instead, Tiwanaku grew like a stone warmed by sun, slowly, steadily, shaped by shared purpose. The people here mastered the land through their raised field system, sucker collars, which harnessed the very breath of the earth to nurture crops. These fields, flanked by canals, created pockets of warmth that protected against frost. In time, this mastery of agriculture allowed the city to flourish, sustaining thousands. And as the population grew, so too did the city's sacred architecture. Long before the stones of Akapana and Kalasasaya were laid, the people gathered in open courtyards, marked by pillars and offerings. Over time, these ceremonial places became more complex, more enduring. Monuments began to rise. Stones were cut with precision. Alignments with the sun and stars were planned. A vision was taking shape, not merely of a city, but of a sacred world, mirrored in stone. By the 7th century, Tiwanaku was no longer just a gathering place, it was the spiritual heart of an entire region. A city unlike any other in the Andes. Rooted not in dominance, but in devotion. And now, from these first walls and ceremonial grounds, our path leads deeper still into the sacred heart of Tiwanaku, where stone, sun, and ceremony would converge to shape its most enduring wonders. As Tiwanaku grew from scattered settlements into a ceremonial center, its people turned their eyes upward. Not only to the mountains, not only to the sun, but to the heavens in their full turning. They watched the stars trace paths across the night. They saw the shadows of the solstices. They studied the breath of wind and cloud, and from all of this, they began to build. What rose from the earth was more than architecture. It was a reflection of the cosmos, a city of stone meant to echo the world above. Akapana, the sacred mountain made by hands. In the center stood Akapana, a great step platform, 7 levels rising in quiet symmetry. It was not a natural hill, but a constructed one, shaped with care, faced with massive stone blocks. At its summit, archaeologists believe, lay a sunken court, perhaps a place of ritual, perhaps a space for communion with the sky. Its form echoed the mountains beyond, artificial yet natural, sacred yet built. Within it ran a system of channels for water, guiding its flow like veins through a living body. Rain was not merely collected here. It was shaped, led, directed, perhaps symbolizing the gift of the gods, the life force of the land. Kalasasaya, a temple for the horizon. North of Akapana stretched Kalasasaya, a great rectangular court, walled in stone. Its walls were not smooth. They were made of vertical pillars, each standing like a sentinel. These pillars were aligned with care, marking the movement of the sun, its rise and fall through the year. This was a place of solar observation, of ceremony, and of gathering. At its western edge stood the Gate of the Sun, a single stone, carved from a massive block, its top forming a lintel above a central opening. Above that doorway is a figure often called the staff god, standing with arms outstretched, flanked by winged beings. Around them, geometric forms radiate like sun rays or tears. No one knows exactly what this gate meant, but all agree, it was made with purpose. The sun would rise through it. And as it did, the people would know the season, the time, the divine rhythm of the year. Pumapunku, the puzzle of the gods. Further west lay Pumapunku, the door of the puma. It was a platform, broad and low, shaped in a T. The stones used here were enormous, some over 100 tons. And they were carved with a precision that still defies easy explanation. Each stone was shaped to fit another. Edges perfectly straight. Angles sharp. Some blocks were joined by metal clamps poured into grooves, an early use of cold-forged metallurgy. It is not a temple in the traditional sense. Rather, it may have been a gateway, a place of transition, of ceremony, of passage from one state to another. Its broken stones lie scattered now, but the precision remains. Together, these places, Akapana, Kalasasaya, Pumapunku, formed the sacred center of Tiwanaku. They were not merely buildings. They were ideas in stone. The people who built them did so not in haste, but over generations, guided by faith, by tradition, and by the eternal wheel of the sky. Here, stone did not simply endure. It spoke. In Tiwanaku, the sky was not distant. It was near, present in every carved lintel, every shadow cast at dawn, every stone aligned with the sun. To the people of the high plateau, the heavens were not just a backdrop to life. They were part of life itself, alive, ordered, and sacred. Architecture aligned with the cosmos. The builders of Tiwanaku did not place their stones at random. The great temple of Kalasasaya, with its rectangular walls and solitary monoliths, was shaped with intention. Each pillar and opening aligned with the movements of the sun across the horizon. At the equinox, the sun would rise in perfect symmetry. At the solstices, it would reach the far corners of the enclosure, signals of planting and harvest, of the earth's breathing. Akapana, too, echoed the sky. Its stepped form mimicked the sacred mountains surrounding the city, but it also served a higher pattern. Water flowed through its channels like rivers through the heavens, each stream a reflection of rain, lightning, and the life-giving power above. The gate of the sun, a cosmic messenger. Perhaps the most mysterious of all is the gate of the sun. This monolithic doorway, carved from a single block of andesite, stands alone at the edge of Kalasasaya. At its top, a central figure, part man, part deity, stands with rays extending from his head, arms outstretched. He is flanked by rows of winged figures, each repeating a pattern, like the days of a calendar or the phases of the moon. Some believe this figure is Viracocha, the great creator. Others call him the staff god, a deity known across the Andes. But whoever he is, he looks not at the viewer, but beyond, as if reading the sky. Scholars have long studied the carvings, suspecting they may represent a solar calendar. The number of figures, the placement of symbols, all suggest a deep knowledge of time, light, and celestial cycles. Yet the true meaning remains unknown, preserved in silence. The world view of the people. The people of Tiwanaku lived in a world of duality, sky and earth, male and female, sun and moon. They did not see the heavens as separate from the land but as its partner. The stars guided their planting. The solstices marked their seasons. The mountains themselves were considered alive, and in their peaks lived spirits who watched over water, weather, and fate. To build in harmony with the sky was not just practical. It was sacred. In Tiwanaku, there are no written records. No scrolls. No books. And yet, stories remain. They are told not in ink, but in stone. Carved figures, symbols, and forms cover the surfaces of monoliths, gates, and temple walls, each one speaking without a voice. These are not decorations. They are messages. And the people who made them believed the stones could remember. Monoliths, guardians of memory. Throughout the sacred precinct stand tall stone figures, human in shape, but larger than life. Some reach over 7 meters high. They wear carved robes, belts, and headdresses. Their hands hold objects, cups, staffs, small ceremonial items, each one chosen with meaning. They do not smile. They do not move. But they are not lifeless. To those who walked among them, they were ancestors, protectors, intermediaries between the people and the divine. The Bennett monolith, the largest ever found at Tiwanaku, is a towering figure of andesite, its surface etched with layers of symbols, pumas, condors, stepped motifs, and tears that fall from its eyes. It may represent a priest, or a mythical being, or a person who once lived and was made eternal in stone. Other figures, like the ponce and frail monoliths, stand nearby, each unique, each part of the sacred landscape. They were placed in plazas and courtyards, where sunlight and shadow touched them at certain times of year, tying their silence to the sky. The Gate of the Sun, a calendar or a prayer. Carved from a single block, the Gate of the Sun may be the most famous image of Tiwanaku. Above its opening stands a figure, often called the staff god. He holds a scepter in each hand. Rays extend from his head. Around him are 32 winged beings, arranged in 3 rows. Some have human faces. Others have the heads of birds. What do they mean? Some believe this is a calendar, marking the movement of time. Others say it is a vision of the heavens, or a story of creation. And some see in it a God who created the world, weeping for what was to come. Whatever its meaning, it was placed with care. The sun rises through it at particular times of the year. And in those moments, the carved god looks not just ahead, but back through time. Symbols and sacred geometry. All across Tiwanaku, one finds repeating symbols. The stepped cross, the puma, the condor, circles, spirals, and waves. These were not just ornaments. They were expressions of a world filled with layers, upper, middle, and lower. Each layer had its beings, its powers, its rules. The carvings show people in ritual dress. Hands raised. Eyes wide. Some carry snuff trays or small pouches, linked to sacred ceremonies. These were not everyday scenes. They were visions, records of how the people connected to the world beyond the visible. Beneath the shadow of Akapana and Kalasasaya, beyond the solemn faces of the monoliths, lived the many hands that built Tiwanaku, not of stone alone, but of time, effort, and devotion. They were not kings or priests. They were farmers, weavers, herders, and artisans. And through their daily labors, the city breathed, farming the skybound earth. At such altitude, the land could be cruel. Frost came swiftly. Rain came late. But the people of Tiwanaku, through generations of patient learning, tamed the earth. They built sucker collars, raised fields, edged by canals. These mounds absorbed the sun by day and released warmth at night, protecting crops from freezing. The canals held fish and water plants, whose remains fertilized the soil. From this design came abundance. Potatoes, quinoa, beans, food not just to survive, but to sustain a growing city. Families tended these fields with stone tools, their lives moving to the rhythm of the seasons and the stars. The weavers and the thread of meaning. Textiles were more than clothing. They were identity. Woven from the wool of alpacas and llamas, dyed in deep reds, ochres, and blues, they carried symbols, the stepped cross, the puma, the condor. A single garment could show rank, region, or sacred role. Weaving was a careful craft, often passed from mother to daughter, each thread an offering of time. The best textiles were kept for ceremonies or for the elite, treasured more than gold. Artisans of clay and stone. Pottery from Tiwanaku bears animals, gods, and geometric designs. Some vessels were simple, used for storing food or carrying water. Others were painted with striking imagery, feline faces, winged figures, the Andean cross. Many were made for rituals, offered to the gods, or broken as part of a sacred rite. Artisans also carved small stone figures, amulets, and ceremonial tools. Some worked in copper, shaping pins, or blades. Others worked in obsidian or bone. Their work was quiet, steady, shaped by long memory and unseen teachings. Herding the sacred flock. Llamas were essential. They carried loads across the mountains, linking Tiwanaku with distant valleys. Their wool clothed the people. Their meat fed them. Their bones were carved into tools. And in ceremony, they were offered to the gods, an animal whose life was given to renew the balance of the world. Herders moved with the seasons, following grass and water. In their quiet way, they linked the city to the pastures beyond. The people of Tiwanaku lived not only by bread and stone, but by rhythm set not by clocks, but by the turning of stars, the coming of rains, and the sacred calendar known only to those who watched both sky and soil. At the center of this rhythm were their ceremonies, gatherings of body and spirit, of people and gods. Feasts of the sacred calendar. In the plazas of Kalasasaya, beneath the shifting sun, the people would gather. Families and clans, neighbors from distant valleys, pilgrims from highland and lowland, they came bearing offerings, songs, and stories. These were not daily meals, but sacred feasts, timed to the solstices, the harvests, and the movement of the sun. Chicha, a fermented drink made from maize, was poured into ceremonial vessels, keras, often painted with symbols or faces. These cups passed from hand to hand, binding people in shared purpose. As the drink flowed, so too did memory. Myths were told. Pacts were renewed. Ancestors were honored. Llamas were offered, quietly, reverently. Their blood spilled on the earth, not in cruelty, but in covenant. The people gave to the gods so the gods might give in return. The Lake of Origins. To the northwest of Tiwanaku, the waters of Lake Titicaca stretched wide and cold. To the people of the highlands, this was no ordinary lake. It was the place of beginning, the place from which Viracocha, the great creator, had once emerged. On islands and reefs within the lake, ritual sites still rest. There, in small shrines or beneath the waves, archaeologists have found offerings, ceramic incense burners shaped like pumas, tiny gold figures, shells from distant seas, and bones of sacrificed llamas. These gifts were placed with care, lowered into the water, entrusted to the unseen. Pilgrims would have crossed to these sites in reed boats, carrying not only goods but prayers. The role of ritual in unity. Tiwanaku did not grow through war. Its power lay not in armies, but in belief. It drew people through shared ceremony, through a calendar, a faith, and a language of symbols understood from valley to desert. When people gathered, they did more than eat and pray. They became one. Ritual reinforced the bonds between families, communities, and distant settlements. It reminded each person of their place in the cosmos, in the land, and in the long line of those who came before. These rituals made Tiwanaku not just a city, but a world. The sun still rose above Acapana. The shadows still moved across Kalasasaya. And yet, something had shifted. It was not collapse that came to Tiwanaku. It was silence. For centuries, this city had grown not by conquest, but by gathering. It was a center, a heart, where people came not to rule or be ruled, but to take part, to witness the turning of the heavens, to plant according to the stars, to walk between temple stones and feel that their lives meant something greater. But even the most sacred rhythms can be broken. The rains grew uncertain. Crops that once rose from the raised fields with abundance began to falter. The water no longer fed the canals as it had. The delicate balance between people, land, and sky was beginning to fray. Some say drought came slowly, whispering its warnings over generations. Others speak of cold years, when the frost came early and stayed too long. The people adjusted, as they always had. They turned to new valleys, higher hills. Some left not in fear, but in hope, seeking land where the old magic might still hold. But as they left, the center emptied. The plazas were still there. The monoliths still stood. But the voices grew fewer. The songs, softer. The great feasts became memories. And those who remained, perhaps they, too, began to forget why the stones had been raised. Perhaps the gods, too, began to listen less. Tiwanaku did not fall in fire. There was no invasion, no sack, no last stand. It was not a city broken. It was a city released from its purpose, from its people, from the breath that once filled it. By the 12th century, it was quiet. Earth began to cover what hands had shaped. Winds passed through broken walls. The temples, once living, became still. But endings are not always ends. The Inca would come later and stand among these stones. They would whisper the name of Viracocha and say, "Here he once walked." They did not rebuild Tiwanaku, but they remembered it. And in remembering, they gave it new life. That, however, is a story for later. Now, we rest in the quiet after the ending, as the dust settles over a world that once stood so tall. When the last footsteps faded from the plazas of Tiwanaku, the stones remained. Cold, unmoving, exposed to wind and time. But even in abandonment, the city did not vanish. It lingered, not as a place of power, but as a place of memory. And in the Andes, memory does not fade easily. Though the people were gone, their stories did not follow them into silence. Among those who stayed in the surrounding lands, the names endured. They still knew where the gods had once walked, where the sun had risen between sacred stones. They remembered the ceremonies, even if the details were lost. The shape of belief held on, like a melody half remembered but never truly forgotten. Children played near the ruins, perhaps not understanding, but feeling something. Shepherds passed by, whispering to themselves when they glimpsed the eyes of the monolith staring through centuries of weather. Pilgrims still came, not to build or rule, but simply to stand, to feel. And when the Inca rose, long after Tiwanaku had fallen still, they, too, turned their gaze back toward this place. They did not claim it as their own. They did not conquer it. Instead, they honored it. They believed that their god, Viracocha, the creator, the wanderer, had once emerged from these very stones. In the ruins, they saw not decay, but origin. They wove Tiwanaku into their own myths, like a deep root feeding a new trunk. The Inca rulers sent offerings here. Not armies, but respect. They may have known that power without memory is hollow, and so they chose to remember. Even today, long centuries later, the wind that moves through the cracked stones carries more than dust. It carries the breath of old voices. Not in words, but in presence. For the people of the Andes, past and present do not stand apart. They fold into each other like layers of woven cloth. What was, still is, just hidden, waiting. In Tiwanaku, nothing ends completely. The stones are broken, but not lost. The names are whispered, not shouted. The gods are silent, but not gone. And so we move forward, deeper still, into the layers of memory, into the places where Tiwanaku did not die, but changed form. Tiwanaku, though still in body, did not sleep in spirit. As its plazas fell quiet, its influence moved outward, not like a torch passed from hand to hand, but like embers carried by the wind, settling softly across distant lands. Its builders had never carved empires with blades. Their greatness flowed in other ways, through shared symbols, through systems of exchange, through the memory of sacred order. And so, as the city faded, the world it touched did not. In valleys to the south, among the peoples who once brought llama caravans to the ceremonial feasts, echoes of Tiwanaku remained. They built smaller temples in its image, aligned their altars with the sun, and shaped pottery in familiar forms. Though they lived under different skies, they remembered the direction of the sacred. In the highlands and lowlands, where traders once carried fish and obsidian, copper and feathers, communities continued the patterns they had learned. Raised fields still appeared, adapted to local soils. Ceremonial plazas rose, smaller, yes, but with the same stepped motifs, the same patient gaze of stylized faces carved into stone. Even where Tiwanaku had not ruled, it had spoken. And in the years that followed, when new powers rose, when the wary came, when the Inca took shape, the old forms endured. The staff god, born perhaps in Tiwanaku's sacred gate, appears again in wary textiles, in Inca temples. The stepped cross, the duality of sky and earth, the turning of time through solstices, all were carried forward like sacred seeds into new soil. What was Tiwanaku, then? Not a fallen city. A beginning. It became a mythic ancestor to the Andes, a place people looked back to when seeking origin, when justifying rule, when naming the gods who shaped the mountains and gave breath to the world. And so, Tiwanaku lived on, not in dominance, but in memory. Even after the stones of Tiwanaku lay scattered and its courtyards gathered dust, the pattern it had traced across the Andes did not unravel. It lingered, not as a shadow, but as a quiet framework upon which later civilizations would weave their own designs. The wary, who rose to power as Tiwanaku waned, carried something of that memory. Though their capital lay far to the north, in what is now Ayacucho, the rhythm of their sacred spaces echoed those of the Altiplano. Their temples, too, were aligned with the sky. Their art, intricate and ordered, bore the same divine geometry, stepped forms, interlocked figures, gods who held staffs and stared with unmoving eyes. But the inheritance was not architectural alone. The warily built roads, long, straight, enduring, across the mountains and valleys. These would later become the skeleton of the great Inca Empire. Yet before them, Tiwanaku had already laid pathways, not of stone, but of belief and movement, through trade, marriage, pilgrimage, and shared ritual. Communities that had once gathered at the great feasts of Tiwanaku did not forget what it meant to be part of something larger. They carried that sense of belonging with them, adapting it to new places, new times. Even the Inca, when they rose centuries later, claimed descent from these sacred roots. They looked to Tiwanaku not as a rival of the past, but as a holy ancestor. In their stories, it was from Lake Titicaca, from the very waters beside Tiwanaku, that their divine founders, Manco Capac and Mama Oclo, first emerged. It was from Viracocha, the great god of the pre-Inca world, that they claimed their cosmic right to rule. And so Tiwanaku, though abandoned, stood not as a ruin, but as a shrine. A point of return. A silence filled not with absence, but with presence so deep it no longer needed to speak. In the valleys, in the high passes, in the places where rivers split and mountains reached the stars, Tiwanaku had left more than buildings. It had left a way of seeing. In Tiwanaku, time was not counted, it was carried. It was not a sequence of days, but a cycle, a rhythm, a sacred breath that moved between the stars and the earth. To live in Tiwanaku was to walk inside this rhythm, to feel one's place not only in the present moment, but across generations, across seasons, across the very bones of the land. There were no clocks. No scrolls of calendars hung upon walls. And yet, the people of Tiwanaku knew time with a precision born not of instruments, but of observation, ritual, and repetition. The circle of the sun. At the heart of the sacred city stood Kalasasaya, its great stone courtyard open to the sky. It was no simple plaza. Its walls, its pillars, its gateways, all were placed with care, aligned to the turning of the sun. At solstice and equinox, the light would pass through its markers, tracing the invisible path of time. Each moment of light and shadow became a sign, a call to plant, to harvest, to celebrate, to fast. The people did not simply use time. They honored it. They dressed it in ceremony. They marked its passing with offerings of food, of drink, of sacrifice. Time was not a tool. It was a being. A presence. Something to live alongside, not to command. The great God and the eternal watch. Upon the gate of the sun, the staff god stands surrounded by winged figures, each one perhaps a marker of days or phases. No one today can say with certainty what these symbols meant. But those who carved them knew. They understood time not as a straight line, but as a great turning. A wheel. What had happened would happen again. What was sown would return. What was lost would be found in a new form. Their ceremonies reflected this belief. The same rituals returned with each cycle. Each feast was both a memory and a prophecy. In this way, Tiwanaku became not only a city in space, but a city in time, led upon itself, echoing through each year. Time held in hands and soil. Farmers felt the breath of time in the land. They watched the first frost, the rise of stars in the cold season, the deepening color of the lake. Weavers followed patterns passed down for generations, never written, only remembered, each design a mark of lineage and season. Artisans, too, shaped time. The same symbols carved on monoliths were repeated in ceramics, textiles, even in the arrangement of offerings placed within temple walls. Each act was not only for the present, but for the continuity of life, a sacred promise that what had begun would continue. In the sacred imagination of Tiwanaku, not all beings walked upon two legs. The world, for them, was never divided between man and animal, but woven, thread by thread, with spirits who took the form of beasts. To know the world was to know these creatures, not as symbols alone, but as companions, messengers, and watchers between realms. Three of these beings stood above all the rest: the puma, the condor, and the serpent. They were not merely animals. They were the embodiment of power, motion, and transformation, guardians of the three planes of existence. The puma, strength of the middle world. The puma walked the same earth as men, but with different eyes. It moved in silence, struck without warning, and vanished without trace. To the people of Tiwanaku, the puma was the soul of this world, K Pasha, the here and now. It appears again and again in their art, carved on stone, painted on pottery, stylized into geometric strength. Warriors may have worn its image. Rulers may have called upon its spirit before great decisions. But even the farmer, planting seeds beneath the cold sky, knew the puma's strength, its endurance, its solitude, its fierce patience. The city itself, some have said, was shaped in its image. Its very layout, with raised platforms and sunken courts, echoed the body of the great cat. The condor, messenger of the heights. Above the mountains, where even the clouds seemed to grow tired, the condor soared. Black wings, white collar, a crown of stillness, the condor belonged to the heavens, to Hanan Pasha, the upper world of gods and stars. It fed not on the living, but the dead. It took what had passed and carried it upwards. Thus, it became a bridge between life and death, between offering and acceptance, between earth and sky. In rituals, feathers may have been used as symbols of flight, as signs that prayers had risen. Ceremonial objects carved with outstretched wings reminded the people to lift their eyes, to seek the greater pattern unfolding above them. The serpent, the path below. Beneath the soil, beneath the roots and stones, coiled the serpent. Not feared, but revered, the guardian of Uku Pasha, the deep world. It moved unseen, yet its presence shaped everything. The people of Tiwanaku did not separate the living world from the one beneath. Ancestors were buried in seated positions, offerings placed with them, coca leaves, small figures, cups. The serpent was their companion in this descent. It was not death they feared, but disconnection. And the serpent ensured that connection remained. It also symbolized knowledge, change, rebirth, for it shed its skin, like time shedding seasons, like day shedding night. There are endings that arrive like a storm, sudden, violent, unforgettable. And then there are those that come like dusk, slowly, quietly, with the sun still warm on the stones, even as the shadows stretch longer. So it was in Tiwanaku. The city did not fall by conquest. No enemy came crashing through its gates. No fire consumed its temples. Instead, life began to pull away, like water drawing back from the shore. One by one, the rituals stopped. The songs grew fainter. The courtyards emptied. But for a time, the structures remained, proud, still, as if waiting. It began, perhaps, with the land itself. The climate shifted. The rains that once filled canals and nourished raised fields came less often, or not at all. The people had mastered their environment, but even their mastery had limits. Frost came early. Harvests failed. Hunger, once rare, began to visit more frequently. Communities that once gathered at Tiwanaku now turned inward. Some moved away, back into the high valleys or toward new water sources. Others remained, stubborn or faithful, tending to what they could, even as the world around them changed. Trade routes that had once pulsed with goods and pilgrims slowed. Pottery styles changed. Symbols faded. And the great feasts, those sacred gatherings that had stitched the land together, grew smaller, then ceased. But the stone stood. The gate of the sun remained, though its watchers no longer came at solstice. Akapana held its shape, though no voices echoed through its terraces. Pumapunku, with its impossible blocks, lay partly broken, as though the earth itself had shifted beneath it. It was not destruction. It was unraveling. Yet in that unraveling, something endured. The people may have left, but they did not forget. In villages and small shrines, they carried the memory. They told stories. They carved old symbols into new clay. They remembered the path of the sun across Kalasasaya. They spoke the names of gods who no longer answered, but were still believed in. And perhaps, in some quiet way, they hoped the city would one day breathe again. When the voices of government fell silent in Tiwanaku, something deeper took their place. The stones, now cold and cracked, began to serve a new purpose. They were no longer the seat of rule, they became relics. Not relics of ruin, but relics of origin. What remained was not just a city. It was a story carved into the earth. People still came. Not in caravans of trade, not to offer grain or build terraces, but in ones and twos, in families, in pilgrims who walked with quiet steps. They came because the place meant something. Even if they no longer remembered all the rites, they remembered the feeling. The stillness. The weight of the air around the gate of the sun. The way the wind changed tone among the monoliths. They came because something lived here, even after the people had gone. The Inca looked backward. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell in other valleys. And then, far to the north, a new power emerged, the Inca. They built with stone. They watched the sky. They carried staffs and worshipped the sun. When they came to Tiwanaku, they did not tear it down. They stood in its courtyards and said, "This is where our God came from. This is where Viracocha walked when the world was young." They did not build over Tiwanaku. They built from it. They folded it into their own memory, like an elder whose wisdom must be honored, even if not fully understood. In this way, Tiwanaku became more than history. It became myth. To the Inca, it was a sacred root. A place not of politics, but of power beyond time. And by honoring it, they strengthened their own claim to divine order. The stones hold their silence. And still, the stones remained. When wind passed through the broken doorways, it did not carry words, but those who listened carefully could feel something. Not a message, perhaps, but a presence. A sense that beneath the dust and lichen, a memory still pulsed. Not in names. Not in dates. But in the alignment of light at solstice. In the shape of a puma under the stars. In the weight of footsteps on worn paths. Tiwanaku had become something few cities ever do. It was no longer alive, and yet it had not died. It was not forgotten, and yet no one truly remembered all it had been. It existed in the space between, like a dream passed down across generations, half lost, half believed. In Tiwanaku, there were no written records. No letters carved into stone. No papyrus. No codices. And yet, there was knowledge. There was law. There was memory. All passed on, not through ink, but through gesture, rhythm, and stone. This was not a culture without meaning. It was a culture where meaning lived in different places, in the turning of the sun, in the symmetry of temples, in the steps of a ritual dance, in the weaving of a cloth. They did not write books. They became them. Memory in motion. Among the people of Tiwanaku, knowledge was held in the body. The way one moved during a feast. The word spoken when planting the first seed. The correct path to walk between altars at equinox. These were not rules written down, they were rules lived, performed, repeated. The elders remembered. The children watched. And so the thread was never cut. This was a world where a priest might carry in his steps the exact movements required to open the season. Where a farmer, simply by lifting his eyes to the sky at dawn, could tell whether the rain would come. Where a weaver's hand knew not just pattern, but story. Philosophy in shape. Look at the stones of Tiwanaku. They are not random. They are not decorative. They speak. The Gate of the Sun is not only a monument, it is a calendar. A vision. A portal through which time itself passes. The staff god, arms extended, is not merely a figure, he is a center. Around him, order radiates. In the temples, symmetry reigns. Staircases descend toward the earth, then rise again, as if to show the cycle of descent and return. Walls are not straight because they must be, but because they point to stars, to solstices, to meanings older than words. The people of Tiwanaku thought not in sentences, but in relationships. Between man and mountain. Between season and spirit. Between death and birth. Their philosophy was not spoken. It was built. The seen and the unseen. To them, the visible world was only part of the story. Beneath every act, every stone, every season, there was an unseen counterpart. This is why their cities were built on layers. Why their gods held tools in both hands. Why their art repeated the same forms: puma, condor, serpent, each one representing a plane of existence. It was not just what one did, but when. Not just what one saw, but what it meant. To modern eyes, this may seem simple. But there is a depth here, a sophistication without abstraction, a wisdom that did not need symbols, because it was lived every day. In the absence of written language, Tiwanaku turned to pattern, not as decoration, but as expression. Their pottery, their textiles, their carvings on stone, all were woven with thought. These designs were not random. They were messages. In cloth and clay, the people told stories, marked time, and recorded truths, not with letters, but with symbols passed from hand to hand. The clay as canvas. Tiwanaku pottery was not merely functional. Yes, it carried water. It stored food. But it also carried meaning. Jars, cups, bowls, each bore images drawn with careful hands. Some showed stylized animals, felines, birds, fish. Others showed figures with elaborate headgear, arms outstretched, flanked by sacred signs. The same form seen on the Gate of the Sun appeared again in red and black on polished clay. These were not portraits. They were symbols. Perhaps gods. Perhaps ancestors. Perhaps the essence of things too great for words. Some vessels bore stepped motifs, symbols of movement, of levels of the world, of journeys taken not only by feet, but by spirit. Others bore eyes, wide and unblinking, the gaze of a watcher, or the reflection of the self in the sacred. When these pots were used in ceremony, filled with chicha, passed from hand to hand, then broken, it was not just an act of celebration. It was a ritual. A way to send meaning back into the earth. Weaving as remembrance. And then there were the textiles. If the city fell, and the stones cracked, the cloth was the first to vanish. Yet for the people of Tiwanaku, textiles were treasures, carried on the body, wrapped around offerings, placed with the dead. To weave was to remember. Geometric patterns told of status, origin, and purpose. Colors carried meaning, not just beauty, but association with places, elements, or divine forces. In some textiles, the symmetry of design echoed the dualism of Tiwanaku's worldview, left and right, upper and lower, day and night. Each cloth was a world. Woven by women whose hands moved with memory, whose mothers had taught them, and whose grandmothers had taught before that. Even after the fall of Tiwanaku, the patterns remained, in distant valleys, in highland villages. Repeated. Preserved. Respected. The language without sound. Through these crafts, the people of Tiwanaku spoke across time. They did not write laws. They wove them. They did not draw maps. They walked them, and carved the paths into the minds of their children. They did not write prayers. They offered them in shapes, in clay, in wool, in feather, in stone. And the gods, perhaps, listened, not with ears, but through the presence of order, color, and intention. For the people of Tiwanaku, the land was not a backdrop. It was not an object to be used, or a place to be owned. It was alive, breathing, watching, giving. And every hill, every spring, every patch of soil was part of a sacred conversation between humans and the world that held them. They did not live on the land. They lived with it. Mountains as ancestors. Look around the basin of Lake Titicaca, and you will see the great mountains, silent, towering, patient. These were not just geological forms. They were beings. Apis, the people called them in later Andean speech, lords of the peaks. Watchers of time. Givers of weather. Guardians of balance. Each community had its mountain. A protector. A presence to whom offerings were made, coca leaves, chicha, even small figures carved from stone or bone. Not in fear, but in respect. In gratitude. The mountains shaped not just the skyline, but the calendar. Their shadows marked the turning of seasons. Their snowmelt fed the rivers. Their moods foretold the year ahead. To live in Tiwanaku was to live under the gaze of stone ancestors higher than any human power. Water as the blood of the world. Tiwanaku could not have existed without mastery of water. And yet, that mastery was not domination. It was partnership. The raised field system, Sucker Collis, was a marvel of design, but also of reverence. Water was guided, not forced. It was allowed to move, to breathe. The canals became habitats for aquatic life, whose decay nourished the soil. The water protected the crops from frost, absorbing warmth by day and releasing it at night. Rainfall was awaited, not demanded. Springs were tended, not drained. And lakes, especially the great Lake Titicaca, were sacred in every sense. Ritual offerings were lowered into the depths. Ceremonial centers were built near the shore, not for commerce, but for communion. To pour chicha into the earth or the lake was not waste. It was reciprocity. Soil and stone, life and cycle. Every act of farming, every journey taken across the plateau, was part of a relationship. The earth gave, but it required care, ritual, humility. To take without giving back was to unbalance the cycle. This understanding lay at the core of Tiwanaku's philosophy, not written in text, but in terrace and temple. In the way the city aligned itself with the land, rather than against it. In the way its courtyards opened to the mountains. In the way its structures invited light, rain, wind, not to keep them out, but to let them pass through. The world was not a possession. It was a relative. And one does not command a relative. One listens. We have walked far now, through temples and fields, along sun-marked walls and into the silent breath of ceremony. And here, at the halfway point of this long journey, we must pause. Not to turn back, but to look inward. For Tiwanaku was never just a place. It was an understanding. To those who built it, Tiwanaku was not merely a city, it was a center. Not a center of power, as empires know it, but a center of order. A point where the cycles of sky, land, and spirit aligned. Where things made sense. Where people could live in harmony with the world and with one another. Its heart beat not in conquest, but in coordination of field and feast, of God and season, of stone and shadow. Even now, standing before broken gates and scattered monoliths, one feels not ruin, but presence. The silence is not empty. It is full. What held it together? It was not armies that made Tiwanaku last. It was not walls, nor taxes, nor fear. It was rhythm. The rhythm of water flowing through canals. Of llamas moving along highland paths. Of hands weaving. Of feet dancing. Of sunrises and solstices. Of ceremonies returned to year after year, like old friends arriving again with the seasons. It was also faith, not just in gods, but in balance. In reciprocity. In the sacred relationship between the human and the more than human. This is what made Tiwanaku more than stone. This is what held it together, even when the world began to shift around it. What endured? When Tiwanaku faded, it did not vanish. Its stones did not become rubble. Its memory did not scatter. It settled deep into the soil, deep into the minds of the Andean people. In myths told by firelight. In patterns passed through generations. In pathways still walked by those who feel, even if they do not say, that something once lived here and still does. Tiwanaku became a whisper. A route. A compass. Even now, in the 21st century, people visit. Not always to learn, sometimes just to stand. To feel. To wonder. Because Tiwanaku still holds something. Not in books. Not in data. But in stone and silence and alignment. As the centuries passed and new peoples moved across the highlands, Tiwanaku did not disappear. Its stones may have weathered, its rituals faded from memory, but the shape of Tiwanaku, its order, its world view, echoed on. It echoed in the way villages built their plazas. It echoed in the festivals timed to the sun. It echoed in the quiet reverence for the mountains. Where Tiwanaku had once stood as a center, now its pattern spread, not as an empire, but as a way of life carried gently from one valley to the next. A quiet transmission. In the centuries after Tiwanaku's decline, people still lived in its shadow, not always physically, but culturally. Local groups emerged, each with their own customs, languages, and alliances. But their world was not new. It was shaped by what Tiwanaku had been. Ceremonial centers in other regions began to mirror Tiwanaku's forms, sunken plazas, carved monoliths, stepped platforms. Pottery carried forward familiar motifs, the staff god, the puma, the condor. Even the practice of aligning sacred sites with the solstices continued, as if the stars themselves had never stopped whispering. What Tiwanaku began, others remembered. not always by name, but by rhythm. In the threads of cloth and ceremony. Andean textiles long after Tiwanaku's fall still bore echoes of its patterns. The stepped cross, the interlocking figures, the balance of symmetry and movement. These were not fashion, they were language. In festivals held in mountain villages, echoes of the old calendar lived on. People danced in circles. Offerings were made to the earth. Llamas were sacrificed not in fear, but in thanks, a quiet contract between the human and the divine. Even in the structure of local leadership, shared tasks, communal fields, ritual obligations, we can glimpse the ghost of Tiwanaku's sacred economy. Its memory was not preserved in monuments alone, but in habits, in values, in the slow inheritance of meaning passed through acts, not words. The land does not forget. And the land itself, the sacred earth, held Tiwanaku close. The mountains still carry the names of spirits. The lake still reflects the sky as it did 1,000 years ago. And the people, even now, walk with their eyes on both the trail ahead and the stories behind. Among all the achievements of Tiwanaku, the temples, the monoliths, the alignments with sun and star, perhaps the most profound lay not in stone, but in soil. The raised field system, known today as sucker collars, was not only a marvel of agricultural engineering. It was a quiet testimony to the way Tiwanaku understood the earth, not as a resource, but as a living partner. Here, beneath the thin air of the high plateau, where frost comes even in summer and water hides beneath stone, the people learned how to listen to the land. And the land responded. The art of cultivating with the cold. To survive on the Altiplano is to live in negotiation with nature. The nights bite. The rains are brief. And yet, the people of Tiwanaku fed thousands, not through conquest, but through care. They shaped the land into long, raised beds of soil, each one bordered by canals. These canals served many purposes. By day, they absorbed sunlight. By night, they released warmth into the air, creating a pocket of protection against frost. The canals also held fish and aquatic plants. Their decomposition enriched the soil. The system was self-sustaining. It recycled, breathed, adapted. It was alive. Where other systems failed, the sucker collis endured. It was farming in harmony, not just a technique, but a relationship. A sacred pattern in earth. To build these fields was to honor the land. They were not laid out in careless rows. They followed the contours of the earth. They curved. They undulated. Some even formed shapes seen from above, spirals, waves, perhaps even animals. Whether intentional or intuitive, the land was not divided. It was embraced. And like everything in Tiwanaku, there was a rhythm. Fields were rotated. Canals were cleaned. Offerings were made, a sprinkle of chicha, a handful of coca, the whispered name of a mountain. To plant was to pray. To harvest was to give thanks. Legacy in the soil. Long after the city was silent, the raised fields remained. In the 20th century, scholars and local farmers began to restore them, not from nostalgia, but from necessity. And what they found confirmed what Tiwanaku had always known: these fields still worked. In some years, they outperformed modern methods. Not through machinery, but through balance. Even now, across the highlands of Bolivia and Peru, farmers walk among the bones of these ancient systems. Some have brought them back to life. Others have never left them. The earth remembers. To those who lived in Tiwanaku, the land was not mute. It spoke. Not in language, but in signs, in the curl of a cloud, the rhythm of the rains, the taste of the wind. And if one knew how to listen, the land could guide, could warn, could bless. This was not superstition. It was not fear. It was relationship. The people of Tiwanaku did not see themselves as masters of nature. They saw themselves as one thread in a vast, breathing fabric, woven from mountain, sky, river, stone, and seed. They belonged to the land, not the other way around. The sacred landscape. Certain places in the Tiwanaku world were not just beautiful, they were alive. A mountain was not only tall. It was watching. A spring was not only clear. It was speaking. The lake was not only deep. It was remembering. Rituals were not performed just in temples. They were carried out at cliffs, caves, riversides. Offerings were buried beneath stones, tucked into crevices, floated on the water's surface. The land itself was the altar. And so, to change the land, to dig, to build, to plant, was always done with care. With permission. With the knowledge that every action had meaning, and that meaning would echo. Reciprocity, not exploitation. The central idea was simple: thine. What you take, you must return. If the earth gives you food, you give thanks. If the river gives you fish, you offer a part back. If the sky brings you rain, you honor it with song. This was not a transaction. It was a rhythm. A pulse between all things, human and more than human. Life flowed in circles, not lines. Even illness, misfortune, or drought were not random. They were signs of imbalance, not punishment, but reminders. To live well was to live in balance. To live respectfully. And that respect shaped everything, from how food was grown, to how houses were built, to how the dead were buried. A place of teaching. Tiwanaku itself was not only a city. It was a map. Its alignment with the heavens. Its relation to the lake. The way its temples opened toward the mountains. All of it taught a lesson: this is how to live in the world. Not above it. Not apart from it. But within it. Beneath the temples and beyond the plazas, Tiwanaku was made of homes. Not palaces. Not fortresses. Homes, clustered, humble, practical, and full of life. And in those homes, the rhythms of daily existence played out quietly, meals prepared, fibers spun, songs hummed to sleeping children. Though we know less about these lives than of the monuments, their echoes remain, in pottery shards, worn paths, traces of fire pits, and the shape of walls built to hold warmth and kinship. Let us walk now, not into ceremony, but into a dwelling. Let us see the city not through the eyes of a priest or a pilgrim, but through the eyes of someone who simply lived. The shape of shelter. The homes of Tiwanaku were made not from grandeur, but from wisdom. Adobe walls, stone foundations, thatched roofs, built low to the ground to resist the mountain wind. Grouped in compounds, multiple buildings around a shared courtyard. In these compounds, several families might live together, related through blood or marriage or alliance. The courtyard was where work happened, weaving, drying food, repairing tools. It was where children played and elders sat in the sun. There was no palace on a hill. No single house that ruled them all. The wealth of Tiwanaku lay not in kings, but in community. The food of the plateau. Meals were shaped by the land. Potatoes, quinoa, beans. Maize in the lower valleys, freeze-dried tuna in the highlands. Meat from llamas, dried into charqui. Fish from the lake. Wild greens when the rains were kind. Cooking was done in simple hearths, clay stoves built low to the ground, often in a corner, near the door. Women tended the fires. Children fetched water. Meals were not large, but they were shared. And on special days, festival days, the food changed. Chicha flowed. Roasted meat was offered. The memory of the gods passed through the steam of the pot. The labor of life. Most in Tiwanaku were not artisans or priests. They were laborious, farmers, weavers, herders. Their hands bore calluses. Their backs carried burdens. But their work was not without dignity. To tend the fields was a sacred task. To weave was to speak without words. To raise children, to bury the dead, to build a home, all were part of the sacred rhythm. Children learned by watching. By doing. There were no schools, only memory, passed from hand to hand. Elders were not discarded. They were the libraries. The keepers of story. The ones who knew when to plant, when to pray, when to pause. Life without loneliness. In Tiwanaku, a person was never truly alone. They were part of something, a family, a clan, a landscape, a lineage. Even after death, they remained in the circle. The dead were buried close to home. Seated, wrapped in textiles, accompanied by offerings, food, tools, symbols. Death was not a departure. It was a turning, a movement into another layer of the world. The hearth, then, was more than warmth. It was continuity. Not all sacred places in Tiwanaku were carved in stone or crowned with gates. Many were quiet, unmarked, known only to those who lived nearby and to the spirits who watched over them. These were the altars without walls, the shrines beneath trees, the offerings tucked between stones, the rituals spoken, not displayed. If the great temples were the voice of Tiwanaku, then these were its breath, soft, constant, unseen. Sacred spaces in common places. Along the footpaths that crossed the plateau, travelers sometimes paused. Not to rest, but to leave something, a pebble, a flower, a splash of chicha poured gently onto the ground. These small acts were offerings, made not out of fear, but out of habit, gratitude, respect. A stone outcrop might be a place of power. A tree growing alone in the wind might be a messenger. A pool that never dried, even in the dry season, might be a doorway. No grand ceremony was needed. A whispered word was enough. These moments of devotion were woven into daily life, not separated from it. There was no sacred day, because all days held the sacred. Household rituals. Within the home, ritual lived beside the fire. At the start of planting season, a family might burn herbs, a signal to the spirits of the land that the time had come. Before a meal, a small portion might be set aside, not for waste, but as an offering to the earth. Children learned these acts not from formal instruction, but from repetition. They saw their parents do them. Their grandparents. The gesture became natural, part of being alive. Births were marked quietly. Deaths with ceremony. The dead might be wrapped and buried beneath the very courtyard where the living continued to work and eat. The boundaries between life and afterlife were soft, not walls, but veils. Ritual objects, everyday hands. Small figurines carved in stone. Tiny ceramic vessels. Pieces of shell or bone with careful marks. These were not decorations. They were tools of presence. To hold one was to hold a link to a god, an ancestor, a force of nature. Some were kept hidden. Some were passed down. Some were buried, not to be forgotten, but to let them return to the earth, the source of all things. The sacred was not distant. In Tiwanaku, the gods did not live far away. They lived within the stone, the water, the mountain, the wind. To connect with the divine did not require a priest or a temple. It required attention, stillness, reverence. That is what these quiet rituals taught, that the world is never empty. That something is always listening. Though Tiwanaku left no written names of rulers, no lists of kings or battles won, we know that there were leaders. Not because they built monuments to themselves, but because the city held together for centuries. Such unity, such harmony between people, land, and sky, does not happen by chance. There were those who guided, those who watched, those who carried responsibility not as privilege, but as weight. They were the keepers of order. Power without spectacle. The leaders of Tiwanaku did not live above their people in towering palaces. Their power was quiet, ceremonial, embedded in ritual rather than conquest. Their authority came not from wealth or fear, but from their role as mediators, between human and divine, between community and cosmos. They organized labor for the great temples. They oversaw the planting and the feast. They ensured that the rituals of solstice, of rain, of harvest were held at the right moment, in the right way. They did not command the people. They oriented them. Just as the sun marked the time to plant, and the mountain warned when snow would come, the leader in Tiwanaku gave shape to the year, to the flow of work and worship. Sacred legitimacy. A ruler was not just chosen. He was recognized by signs, by lineage, by alignment with sacred forces. His right to guide was linked to his ability to maintain balance, in weather, in harvests, in the health of the land. If the rains failed, it was not simply misfortune, it could mean the ruler had lost favor with the divine. Thus, leadership was not absolute. It was conditional and deeply sacred. Those who ruled wore symbols, perhaps the stepped motifs of the three realms, the staff of divine authority, the tunic woven with the geometry of the cosmos. Their garments spoke even when they were silent. They were not just administrators. They were embodiments of Tiwanaku's principles, walking in rhythm with the stars. Council and community. There is reason to believe leadership in Tiwanaku was not solitary. It may have been shared among a council, elders, priests, planners. Those who held different kinds of wisdom for the fields, for the heavens, for the bones of the ancestors. This kind of collective governance reflects Tiwanaku's core, balance. Not one voice above all, but many voices woven together. Each with its place. Each with its moment. Tiwanaku was never an empire in the way later Andean powers would be. It built no road system to rival the Inca. It sent no armies to conquer lands. Its rule was not stamped in iron, but whispered across mountains. And yet, its influence spread far. From the shores of Lake Titicaca to valleys hundreds of kilometers away, its presence was felt. Not through domination, but through connection. This was a reach without chains. Trade and trust. Tiwanaku's heart was ceremonial, but its arms stretched outward through networks of exchange. Llamas, strong and sure-footed, carried goods across the mountains: maize, wool, salt, obsidian, dried fish, and more. Along these paths came not only food and tools, but ideas. A ceramic style from the city might appear in a distant valley. A symbol carved into a local shrine might mirror the forms found in Tiwanaku's plazas. These were not imitations. They were echoes, signs of shared vision. Communities wanted to be linked to Tiwanaku. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. It was not a capital. It was a pilgrimage. To send offerings, to attend ceremonies, to receive goods during a great feast, these were not acts of obedience. They were acts of participation. The soft architecture of influence. Rather than ruling through force, Tiwanaku inspired through meaning. Its temples showed how to align one's life with the sky. Its rituals taught how to give thanks to the earth. Its balance between agriculture and ceremony offered a model for living in difficult lands. When distant settlements built sunken plazas or raised field systems, they were not copying, they were entering into a shared pattern. Tiwanaku did not demand loyalty. It offered belonging. A web, not a throne. If Tiwanaku had power, it was not like a spear, sharp, pointed, narrow. It was like a web, wide, quiet, resilient. Even when the city itself began to empty, that web held. The rituals continued elsewhere. The symbols endured. The way of life, the way of thinking, lived on long after the stone carvings fell silent. To the southwest of Tiwanaku's ceremonial heart lies a place that feels unlike the rest. A place of immense stones, cut with impossible precision, scattered now like the bones of some great beast long gone. Pumapunku. Its name means the door of the puma. And indeed, it feels like a threshold, as if one stands not within a city, but on the edge of a mystery. A place meant to open, but now broken. Shattered. Waiting. A place of precision. The stones of Pumapunku are not simply large. They are exact. Huge blocks of red sandstone, some weighing over 100 tons, were cut and moved here, without iron tools, without the wheel, without beasts of burden strong enough to drag them. Andesite slabs, harder than steel, were shaped into interlocking forms, notched, grooved, polished. Some fit together like puzzle pieces. Some bear joints where bronze clamps once held them fast. To stand among these stones is to feel small. Not because of size alone, but because of intent. Every line, every angle, was made with care, not to impress, but to align, to mean something. And yet now they lie scattered. Some say an earthquake tore it apart. Others speak of abandonment, looting, the long weathering of time. But no one knows for certain. All we see is the broken door. And still, even broken, it speaks. What was it for? No one agrees. Was it a temple? A palace? A platform for the sky? Its layout is unusual, a T-shape, a sunken courtyard, grand staircases that lead nowhere now. It appears older than the rest of Tiwanaku, and yet also more advanced in craftsmanship. Some believe it was a place of initiation. Others say it marked a journey from this world to the next. A place of transformation. And perhaps that's the point. Pumapunku resists certainty. It refuses to be simplified. Like Tiwanaku itself, it was not made to be explained. It was made to be felt. A memory in ruin. To walk among the stones of Pumapunku is to remember something just out of reach, as if the earth once whispered a truth, and now the echo is all that remains. And yet, the beauty endures. In broken pieces, there is still perfection. In fallen stones, there is still intention. The people who built this did not do so for glory. They did not carve their names. They did not build to last forever. They built because they believed. And even now, belief clings to the edges of those shattered slabs, belief in something greater, something orderly, something eternal. By the time the great courtyards of Tiwanaku fell silent, and the raised fields grew cold with disuse, the center had shifted. Not outward, but inward. The rituals did not vanish, they withdrew. They returned to the hearth, to the mountain path, to the quiet corners of memory. This was the final phase of Tiwanaku's spiritual life, not an end, but a retreat. The great temples no longer echoed with the steps of pilgrims, but small fires still burned. Offerings were still made. And in the hearts of the people, the sacred remained. Shrines among the stones. In the last generations of Tiwanaku, people did not try to rebuild the city. They did not raise new walls or reclaim the fields. But they stayed near. They built small shrines using the stones of old temples, not as desecration, but as continuation. They lit fires in places once grand. They made offerings on fragments of what had been altars. These acts were not of mourning, but of intimacy. What had once been public and grand became personal and quiet. A handful of coca leaves. A splash of water. A breath spoken toward the wind. A return to the earth. As the political structure faded, so too did the structures of ritual authority. There were fewer great ceremonies, fewer elite organizers. But in this loss, there was also a return. The people turned again to the land, not as part of a state, but as families, as kin. They listened to the mountains as they always had. They watched the sun, marked the seasons, honored the dead. Even as the city was abandoned, the sacred geography, the relationships between places, rivers, peaks, still held power. Tiwanaku, the city, had fallen. But Tiwanaku, the presence, remained. Not forgotten. Archaeologists find signs of these last rituals, bones carefully placed, broken vessels near hearths, figurines buried in shallow earth. Small acts. Deep meaning. These were not people lost. They were people adapting. Holding on. Refusing to forget. And because of them, we still feel Tiwanaku today are not as a ruin, but as a rhythm carried through time. When Tiwanaku's stones grew cold and its courtyards emptied, its people did not vanish. They moved, quietly, steadily, like water leaving a broken vessel. But they did not spill. They flowed. Some went south, to the valleys where maize still grew strong. Others climbed higher into the mountains, seeking safer slopes, clearer streams. And some remained nearby, settled among the ruins, making lives amid what had once been sacred. Wherever they went, they carried more than tools. They carried memory. What they took with them. They brought the old designs, the stepped cross, the puma, the sun staff. They brought the practice of the raised fields, though smaller now, more practical, shaped by survival. They brought their stories of Viracocha, of the lake, of the stones that once spoke. And they brought the rhythm of planting with the moon, of offering to the springs, of burying the dead not in fear, but in a circle of continuity. No monument was built to mark their leaving. No stone tells us their names. But their presence lingers, in pottery found miles from the city, in agricultural terraces shaped by ancestral knowledge, in rituals that seem to mirror those once held beneath the sun gate. Seeds in new soil. These migrating communities did not mourn the past. They transplanted it. They wove Tiwanaku into new contexts, blending its wisdom with the local customs of where they settled. In time, new cultures would rise. New temples. New gods. But in the symbols, in the ways of honoring earth and sky, Tiwanaku remained. Its memory was not brittle. It was supple. And it was held not by rulers, but by weavers, farmers, children, storytellers, those whose voices are not recorded in history books, but whose hands shape the next age. Not the end, but a branch. The story of Tiwanaku does not end in ruin. It ends in echo. It echoes in the later cultures of the Andes. In the Inca, who saw Tiwanaku not as a failure, but as an origin. In the villagers who still make offerings to the lake. In the silence of the stones, which even now draw people from every corner of the world. To walk away from Tiwanaku is not to leave it. It is to carry it. By the time the Inca rose in the highlands of Peru, Tiwanaku had already fallen silent. Its walls were cracked. Its fields lay fallow. But its presence, its sacred shape, had not faded. The Inca did not ignore Tiwanaku. They revered it. To them, it was not a ruin. It was an origin. The path of Viracocha. In Inca cosmology, the god Viracocha was the great creator, the bringer of sun and stars, of humanity and law. And where did he begin his work? At Lake Titicaca. At Tiwanaku. The Inca told of how Viracocha rose from the waters, walked upon the land, and shaped the world with his words. He passed through Tiwanaku, they said, and there gave order to the earth. The Gate of the Sun was not simply a monument. It was a memory of divine footsteps. By claiming this connection, the Inca linked themselves not just to a god, but to sacred legitimacy. To rule with divine right, they needed a divine beginning. Tiwanaku became that beginning. Pilgrimage, not conquest. Unlike other ancient cities the Inca absorbed, Tiwanaku was not rebuilt. It was not turned into an Inca stronghold. Instead, it was left as it was, a place of pilgrimage, not power. Inca nobles visited to pay homage. Offerings were brought. Ceremonies held. But the site was preserved in stillness, as one preserves a grave or a birthplace. This respect tells us something essential. The Inca did not see Tiwanaku as fallen. They saw it as sleeping. Echoes in empire. Elements of Tiwanaku lived on in Inca practice. The stepped motifs. The alignment of temples with the solstice sun. The integration of water into sacred space. The three sacred animals, condor, puma, serpent, reappear in Inca art and myth. Even the way the Inca viewed their capital, Cusco, as the navel of the world, echoes how Tiwanaku once functioned, not as a military center, but as a cosmic one. The Inca looked to Tiwanaku and saw what they aspired to be, not in scale or power, but in meaning. They inherited not its stones, but its soul. After the Inca, after the whispers of pilgrimage faded and the empire itself collapsed beneath the weight of foreign conquest, Tiwanaku entered a deeper silence. Not the silence of abandonment, that had come long before, but a silence of forgetting. Of drifting beyond the edge of memory. The stones remained. The mountains still stood. But the meanings were buried, in dust, in time, in the gaps between new tongues and old songs. For centuries, Tiwanaku lay quiet. And yet, it was never truly gone. The watchers remain. Even when no priests tended its altars, even when no pilgrims lit fires at solstice, the site was not lifeless. Villagers passed nearby. Herds grazed along the edges. Farmers tilled soil rich with memory. Children played among fallen stones, unaware they walked through the bones of an ancient city. And still, on certain nights, some would leave offerings, a coca leaf, a candle, a whispered name. They might not remember why, but they felt something. The land itself held the memory, even when human voices fell silent. Buried, not lost. Time did not erase Tiwanaku. It covered it. Dust drifted into the corners of sunken courts. Soil piled up along broken stairways. Roots crept through cracks in the stone. What once had been the center of a world now resembled scattered ruins, strange, haunting, almost forgotten. And yet, the stones did not collapse. They waited. Even broken, they endured. Even weathered, they spoke. To those who listened. The memory in the people. Though written history passed Tiwanaku by, the oral traditions held faint echoes. Stories told in Andean villages recalled a place where giants once lived. A city built in a single night. A god who walked across the water, carrying the sun. These stories were not precise. But they pointed. And in pointing, they preserved the thread. So when scholars and wanderers, centuries later, began to ask, "What is this place?" they found that the people, though unsure of dates or kings, still knew it was sacred. That was enough. In the 19th century, as the world beyond the Andes turned its gaze toward ancient civilizations, to Egypt, to Mesopotamia, to Greece, a quiet curiosity also stirred in the Altiplano. Tiwanaku, long slumbering beneath wind and soil, began to draw attention once more. Not from kings or pilgrims, but from scholars, travelers, and dreamers. From those who looked at the shattered gate of the sun and asked, "Who built this? And why?" The stones were awakening. First eyes, fresh wonder. When the earliest chroniclers of the Spanish conquest passed near Tiwanaku, they saw only ruins, vast, strange, and silent. They wrote of giants, of ancient builders whose names had long been lost. But they did not stay. It was not until centuries later that others began to return with different eyes, not to conquer, but to study. In the 1800s, European explorers and South American intellectuals came with notebooks and measuring tools. They mapped. They sketched. They speculated. Some guessed the ruins were older than the Inca. Others believed they might be the remains of a forgotten empire greater still. Few understood what they were truly looking at. But the questions had begun. Digging toward memory. As archaeology slowly emerged as a science, Tiwanaku became a place of serious study. Excavations began. Walls were unearthed. Courtyards re-emerged. Pottery was catalogued. Burial sites were carefully examined. The scattered stones of Pumapunku were measured again and again, their angles found to be impossibly precise. But much damage had already been done. In earlier centuries, stones had been carted away for building. Some monuments were cracked open. Others misinterpreted, repurposed, or left exposed to the elements. Still, Beneath the ruin, knowledge stirred. The more that was uncovered, the more scholars began to understand Tiwanaku was not a local shrine or lost outpost. It was a civilization, complex, expansive, deeply spiritual. A slow reclamation. In time, Bolivian scholars took the lead. Local voices rose to protect the site, to claim it not only as an archaeological wonder, but as a national treasure. Indigenous communities around Lake Titicaca reminded the world Tiwanaku was their legacy. It lived in their blood, their stories, their rituals. And so the stones, once buried and broken, began to be honored again. Not just as objects, but as ancestors. Today, Tiwanaku is no longer a silent ruin tucked in the highlands. It is a place of return, of gathering, of ceremony reborn. It is visited not only by scholars and tourists, but by those who feel its breath in their bones, Aymara communities, Andean elders, those whose ancestors once shaped its stones and walked its sacred paths. For them, Tiwanaku is not past. It is present. It is living heritage. Rituals reclaimed. Each year, on the winter solstice, the Wilkakuti, or return of the sun, people gather before the gate of the sun. As dawn approaches, they raise their hands to the horizon, waiting for the first rays of Inti, the sun god, to pass through the ancient portal. It is not a reenactment. It is a continuity. Dances are performed. Offerings are made. Fires are lit. Elders speak of balance, of Pachamama, Mother Earth, of the need to live in harmony with nature. These acts are not nostalgic. They are necessary. They affirm identity. They connect past and present. They bring memory into motion. Language and land. The Aymara language, spoken by many who live around Tiwanaku, carries echoes of the old world view, a language that sees time not only as linear, but as cyclical. A language where the future is behind, because it is unknown, and the past is in front, because it can be seen. In this language, the land is not object, it is kin. And so, as communities reclaim their voice, they also reclaim Tiwanaku, not as museum, but as relation. Textiles are woven with ancient patterns. Stories are told with reverence. And the stones are spoken to, not just about. Education and identity. In Bolivian schools, children now learn of Tiwanaku not as a myth, but as the foundation of their civilization. Indigenous history is no longer erased. It is embraced. Festivals at Tiwanaku are now state-recognized events. But more importantly, they are community events, led by local people, rooted in ancestral knowledge. The site has become a place not only of learning, but of belonging. A reminder that before the Inca, before the Spanish, before the modern world, there was Tiwanaku. And it still speaks. Even now, centuries after the last hand shaped its walls, Tiwanaku's architecture continues to whisper its truths. Its temples and gates are not merely ruins, they are ideas rendered in stone. Ideas about time. Ideas about place. Ideas about what it means to belong in a world where the human is never separate from the mountain, the sky, or the unseen. To walk through Tiwanaku is to move through meaning. Geometry of the sacred. The people of Tiwanaku did not build randomly. Every structure, every wall, every alignment was part of a greater vision. Temples faced the sun at solstice. Windows aligned with stars. Doorways mirrored one another, creating a rhythm of entry and return. The shapes were symbolic, the stepped motif, repeating again and again, recalled the three realms, the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. A temple was not just a place to worship. It was a model of the cosmos, meant to teach, to center, to harmonize. Even the open spaces were intentional, plazas where people gathered not only for ceremony, but to feel the presence of sky above and sacred earth below. It was architecture as prayer. The doorways. So many of Tiwanaku's structures feature false doors, doorways that go nowhere. But these are not mistakes. They are symbols. They represent thresholds between the visible and the invisible. Between this life and the next. Between the known and the sacred. To pass through such a doorway, even in the mind, is to enact a journey. And that journey was central to Tiwanaku's vision, transformation, return, renewal. Pumapunku, the broken platform, still holds such doorways. Even shattered, they draw the eye. They remind us that some thresholds are not meant to lead outward, but inward. The city as a map. Tiwanaku was not just a city. It was a mirror of the cosmos. The arrangement of its temples mirrored celestial cycles. Its alignment with Lake Titicaca spoke of origin and renewal. Its spatial logic invited movement, not toward power, but toward understanding. In this, Tiwanaku speaks across centuries to architects, artists, seekers, those who sense that form is never just function. That space shapes thought. That beauty, when ordered with purpose, can open the heart to mystery. Though the stones of Tiwanaku remain silent today, once they echoed with sound, of flutes and drums, of voices raised in chant, of feet dancing in time to rhythms now lost. Music was not an ornament to ceremony. It was its breath. Its bridge between the seen and the unseen. In Tiwanaku, to make sound was to shape space. To dance was to remember. And to listen, truly listen, was to touch the sacred. Instruments of earth and spirit. Archaeologists have uncovered flutes made of bone, whistles of ceramic, panpipes crafted from reeds drawn from the shores of Lake Titicaca. These were not toys. They were tools, to call the rain, to guide the dead, to honor the sun. Drums were made of stretched hide, their beats like the pulse of the earth. Rattles shook with the movement of spirits. In sacred rituals, these sounds were not performances. They were offerings. Each note a gesture. Each rhythm a connection. And when the instruments fell silent, the memory of the music remained in the space between stones, as if the city itself still hummed beneath the wind. Dance as devotion. Movement was prayer. During festivals, people did not simply stand and watch. They moved. In circles. In lines. In patterns that mimic the stars or the unfolding of the agricultural year. Each step was a memory. Each turn a return, to ancestors, to cycles, to balance. Dancers wore masks, feathers, woven garments that flickered in the sun. They became animals, spirits, forces of nature. This was not theater. It was transformation. Through dance, the boundaries of the self dissolved, and something greater entered, the past, the sacred, the eternal. The ritual of sound. In Tiwanaku, music and movement were not entertainment. They were ways of knowing, of attuning oneself to the invisible harmonies of the cosmos. The timing of a flute echoed the timing of a season. The rhythm of a drum followed the rhythm of the planting moon. These were not metaphors. They were alignments, lived, felt, believed. And in that alignment, people found belonging. Not as rulers, not as servants, but as dancers in the great circle of existence. The civilization of Tiwanaku left behind no books, no scrolls, no libraries carved in stone. Yet it offered a philosophy, not written, but lived. A way of being in the world that held balance at its core. Today, as the modern world wrestles with disconnection from nature, from time, from meaning, Tiwanaku speaks again. Quietly. Through pattern. Through presence. Through principles older than empire. The law of reciprocity. At the heart of Tiwanaku's way was Aini, the sacred exchange. What you give, you receive. What you take, you must return. This applied not just to people, but to all things, the soil, the rivers, the animals, the ancestors. Life was not a ladder to climb. It was a cycle to honor. This law shaped economy, ceremony, and daily life. Even the planting of a seed was an act of reciprocity, a gift to the earth, which the earth would answer with sustenance. Imagine a world where every action was weighed not by profit, but by balance. This was Tiwanaku. The vision of duality. Tiwanaku did not see opposites as enemies. Male and female. Sun and moon. Water and stone. Each was part of a whole. This duality was not division, it was dialogue. The temple walls reflected it. The textiles wove it. The society lived it. Power was not meant to dominate, but to coordinate, to bring opposites into harmony. In such a worldview, conflict becomes a call to rebalance. Not to defeat, but to understand. Time as a circle. Western thought often sees time as a line, forward, relentless, without return. Tiwanaku saw it differently. Time was a circle. The past was not behind. It was beneath. It supported the present. And it would rise again. Seasons turned. Suns returned. Ancestors walked with the living. This circular time fostered patience. Reverence. A deep trust in rhythm, not control, but participation. A lesson, not a relic. Tiwanaku is often called a ruin. But its worldview is not broken. It still lives, in Andean communities, in ceremonies at solstice, in the slow return to ancestral ways. And beyond the Andes, it offers something rare. A vision of humanity not above nature, but within it. A sense of power not as domination, but as harmony. A future that honors the past, not escapes it. Now we return, not as strangers, but as those who have walked long beside the story. We enter once more the broken gates, step into the open plazas, and stand before the gate of the sun. But something has changed. Not in the stones. In us. We no longer ask, what happened here? We ask, what lives here still? The weight of stillness. Tiwanaku does not speak in words. It speaks in space. In shadow. In alignment. To stand within its sacred bounds is to feel a quiet pressure, not heavy, but full. A reminder that this place once held not just people, but purpose. Look at the monoliths. They are not decorations. They are witnesses. Look at the steps worn down by generations. They are not ruins. They are memory paths. And look at the horizon, where the sun once rose between stones shaped by careful hands. The alignment still holds. The world still turns. The promise remains. Walking with the ancestors. You may not see them, but they are here, in the air, in the dust, in the shape of wind against rock. Not ghosts. Presences. They do not ask to be worshipped. Only remembered. Only heard. They built Tiwanaku not for glory, but for balance. Not to last forever, but to reflect forever the world they believed in, a world of cycles, of harmony, of shared breath between human and divine. To walk these paths is to step into that belief. To feel yourself part of something vast, and yet held. The circle closes. We began with the lake, the land, the vision of Viracocha walking upon the earth. We end with silence, not empty, but full. Tiwanaku has not faded. It has settled. Into soil. Into story. Into the memory of all who feel the sacred in stone and sky. Now we gather the threads, not to tie them off, but to see what they have become. Not a conclusion, but a weaving. What have we seen? A city, yes. A sacred center, certainly. But more than that, a way of being. A way of seeing. Tiwanaku was not merely a place in the past. It was, and still is, a presence in the fabric of the Andes, and perhaps, in the quiet corners of every human longing for balance. What was built? We saw a civilization that carved with care. That planted with purpose. That did not demand from the earth, but entered into agreement with it. We saw temples aligned with stars, fields shaped by water, homes built in circles of kin. We saw art not for art's sake, but as remembrance. And ritual not for control, but for gratitude. They built not to conquer time, but to live within it. What was lost and found? Tiwanaku fell. The raised fields went dry. The chants grew still. The doorways opened onto wind. And yet, it was not gone. Because it had never been held by walls alone. It had been planted in people. Carried in stories. And when the world was ready to listen again, the stones still whispered. They whispered of reciprocity, of sacredness in the soil, of harmony as strength. These are not lessons for the past. They are invitations for the present, the memory we carry. Now, you, who have walked these 39 chapters, carry something too. Not just knowledge, but a trace of Tiwanaku's rhythm. Perhaps in how you see the sunrise, or how you listen to the wind, or how you remember that what you take must be returned. That the past is not behind you. It is beneath you, holding you up. There is a moment, after a story ends, when the listener does not move. Not because they are uncertain, but because they have felt something. And in that stillness, just before the world resumes its noise, the story lingers. Not as words, but as presence. So let us pause here. Let us return, one final time, to the high plateau. To Tiwanaku. To the breath between stone and sky. The city that waits. Tiwanaku no longer shouts. It no longer gathers thousands in procession or marks the sky with banners. But it waits. In every shadowed step of a temple. In every carving that still holds the shape of thought. In every courtyard where silence does not mean absence. It waits not to be rediscovered, but to be understood. To be felt. And through that feeling, to be carried forward, not as ruins, but as rhythm. The gift of return. You have walked this long path, from myth to memory, from stone to seed, from silence to sound. And now, you carry the story. Wherever you go, the gift of Tiwanaku is with you. Not in facts alone, but in the quiet knowing that there once was, and still is, a place where humanity chose harmony over power, reverence over rule, continuity over conquest. A place where to live well was to live with the world, not above it. And perhaps, in remembering that, we come home to something older than history. Something true.